Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to get into the history of Southeast Arkansas, specifically Ashley and Drew counties. And we're looking at this through the lens of a really comprehensive overview you've provided. It's a study in these really profound contrasts, isn't it? You're tracing this evolution from an untamed frontier into one of the most planned industrial landscapes in the entire South.
That's exactly right. We're tracing the growth rings of this region very much like the loblolly pine that defines it. We're starting at that inner core of wilderness struggle, just the sheer effort of settling, of river navigation, and then moving outward to these layers of modern scientific industrial society. We've got so much material here, everything from the first county courts being held in log cabins to this massive experiment in corporate paternalism and really the invention of sustainable forestry.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because the sources show right away that the foundation of this whole region was, well, it was liquid and it was vast. We really need to understand the scale of this great wilderness before we can appreciate how fast and how thoroughly it was tamed. And it was all powered by water and wood long before any real roads came through.
Right, to really get the scope of what settlers and later the industrialists found, you have to picture this place as it was, an almost impenetrable, ecologically rich territory known just as the Great Wilderness.
And defining that landscape is key because it was way bigger than the counties we know today. Our sources describe it stretching from the Mississippi River settlements like Point Chico and then just pushing west all the way to the Waukita River, a dense, wet, heavily forested frontier.
And this wilderness was fundamentally shaped by geology and catastrophe. Cutting right through the middle is Bayou Bartholomew.
The fascinating thing here is the theory that this stream is incredibly old. It's widely believed to have been the original main channel of the Arkansas River.
The actual Arkansas River. What changed that? A massive seismic event. The New Madrid earthquake sequence of 1811 and 1812. It was so powerful it literally rerouted the entire river, shifting it north to the Mississippi.
So this bayou we see today is like a ghost of a much larger river.
Exactly. And the evidence is really compelling. The bayou has these distinct double banks, which is a feature you typically only get from a stream that overflows constantly and drops huge amounts of silt. It suggests this massive heavy flow over thousands of years. And you also got these extensive lakes right next to the bayou, which just reinforces the idea that this was once a much, much larger current.
And long before American settlers arrived, this land was, of course, home to the Quapaw, and the French had already started leaving their mark on the map.
Precisely. The Quapaw people were completely integrated into this river environment. Their diet was rich, pulled directly from the wilderness. Sources talk about bear ribs, various root vegetables, wild produce. Their clothing was functional for the climate. Men wore breechcloths, sleeveless shirts, leggings. The women wore grass skirts and loose blouses. Their whole culture was just woven into the forest.
And the French traders then sort of layered their own history right on top of that.
Absolutely. And their influence is permanent. You see it in the names like Bayou Bartholomew or Chimenon Creek. We have records showing French traders settling along the river as early as, say, 1769 or 1770. We even have the names of three of them, Fogel, Boulit, and Akan, who settled near what became Akan's Bluff. They traded with the local indigenous populations for decades before finally selling out and moving to Louisiana in 1824, right as American settlement was picking up speed.
With no roads, how did anyone move or trade in this swampy, forested place?
Water. Water was everything. It was the highway system. Initially, you had small craft, like flat boats and rafts. To move goods upstream against the current, they used keel boats. These were these narrow, heavily loaded boats that were just painstakingly moved by manual labor, poling or pulling them with ropes from the bank. Then the steamboats arrived, and that changed everything.
This whole water-centric world meant that when it came time to set up a government, the whole process was really fluid, right? Constantly shifting.
It was a very organic process. Before the counties were set, a place called Fountain Hill, which was originally in Bradley County, played this huge role in the 1840s, mostly because it managed to get a U.S. post office in 1846, which made it the communication hub.
So when Drew County was formed later that year, that region just got absorbed into it, and its governmental start was, well, famously humble.
Truly humble. The first term of Drew County Court in October 1846 wasn't in some grand building. It was held in the log cabin home of a man named Alexander Rawls near Fountain Hill. That log cabin, the temporary seat of justice, really symbolized this grassroots effort. And what's wild is that that exact site later became part of Ashley County when the final boundaries were drawn. The political geography was changing that fast.
which led directly to the creation of Ashley County itself.
Yes, Ashley County was carved out in November 1848. The county seat, Hamburg, was laid out very quickly in October of 49. It was reportedly named after Hamburg, South Carolina, where many of the settlers came from. And by 1850, it had its first public buildings, a courthouse, and a jail, which cemented its role as the center of government.
But this highlights how critical the river ports were. Hamburg might have been the political center, but the river towns were the real economic engines.
They were the logistics hubs of the frontier, absolutely. Take Marie Saline, for example. It's situated right near the junction of the Ouachita and Saline rivers. By 1860, it had grown to 56 families. It was this massive commercial hub where steamboats would deliver wares that supplied the entire interior.
So you see this political geography that starts out really liquid, defined by rivers and shifting lines, before it solidifies around these planned county seats. But the real game changer, the thing that created a whole new economic map, was the arrival of heavy industry, which Hamburg famously rejected.
Exactly. That established order in Hamburg was about to face a direct challenge from this colossal industrial vision. And it was a vision they were just not willing to accept.
And this is where we meet the central figure in this whole drama, Edgar Woodward Cap Gates. He was incredibly ambitious, right? He'd managed a mill at Thornton, and he hears about this huge tract of prime virgin pine for sale, 47,000 acres.
A staggering amount of land. So Gates and his investors, who were about to form the Crossett Lumber Company, they approach Hamburg first. It's the logical choice. It's the county seat, it has infrastructure, it has a workforce. The plan was simple: build the mill in Hamburg, if they could just get the land.
But the leaders of Hamburg, the established landowners and businessmen, they just balked. They had this deep fear of industrial disruption.
They absolutely resisted him, and that decision changed the course of Southeast Arkansas history. Hamburg's identity was agrarian. Its leaders were afraid that Gates's huge industrial model, which promised steady year-round wage labor, would just shatter their social order. Their main worry was losing their labor pool, specifically the black laborers who were the backbone of the whole farm economy, to the factory.
And the lure was the wages Gates was offering, wasn't it?
Precisely. He offered an unusually high wage for the region, $1.75 a day. When you compare that to the sporadic, seasonal, often credit-based system of farm labor, it was revolutionary. By refusing to sell Gates the land, Hamburg's leaders were trying to protect their traditional, low-wage agrarian system. They rejected the future to preserve their present.
That's a fascinating twist on the usual story, where a town is begging for an industry to come. Hamburg's resistance basically created a rival city.
It was a huge piece of unintended urban planning. Gates just moved on. He secured the 47,000 acres from some speculators for $7 an acre. The company was incorporated, taking its name from one of the main investors, E.S. Crossett.
So because Hamburg said no, Gates picks a spot a few miles away that was, at the time, little more than a deer stand.
A remote spot, but strategically perfect. The site had immense resources, both pine and hardwood. Crucially, it was on higher ground, which helped with the swampiness, and it had Coffee Creek nearby.
And Coffee Creek was perfect for damming to create the huge mill pond they needed to float and store all the logs.
And the second they start building, the place transforms into Tent City. That just sounds miserable, especially given the timing.
It was a true pioneer boomtown, born out of pure necessity. The winter of 1898-99 was hit with these continuous heavy rains, so employees and their families lived in canvas tents. Sometimes they'd nail boards together to make them a bit more stable. The earliest church services were often held right there in the mud in these tents by wandering Methodist preachers, and it grew incredibly fast as job seekers poured in.
What was daily life like in those first days? Just survival.
Rugged self-sufficiency. There was no market, so food came from the forest. Sources say there was no hunting season. You killed deer and squirrels as you needed them. If a large animal was taken, the whole community shared the meat. Milk came from free-roaming cows, eggs from local chickens. We even have a record of the first baby born in Crossett. W.R. Williams, August 7th, 1902, born in a tent right where Highway 82 is today.
And this is where we get that incredible story about Cap Gates and his instant church. A real show of corporate power.
This story is classic Cap Gates. It shows his speed and his desire for total moral and industrial order. See, state law at the time prohibited saloons from operating within 1 mile of a church. So when Gates hears that a man is on his way to the county seat to get a license for a saloon, he decides to use industrial might to create some instant zoning.
Wait, they used a zoning law and their entire workforce to beat a competitor overnight. That is an astonishing level of control.
It was his signature move. He immediately put all the mill hands to work. They worked through the entire night clearing the site, hauling fresh pine lumber straight from the mill, and putting up a sturdy building that would serve as both a church and a school. The saloon guy went to bed thinking his license was a sure thing. By morning, the building was finished and dedicated. An employee rode the 13 miles to the county seat to tell the judge the saloon license couldn't be granted. A church was already there, an ultimate assertion of corporate order.
And that speed translated directly into industrial scale. By June of 1902, just a couple of years in, the investors had already spent $1 million just starting the company. A huge sum.
The output was immediately massive. The first complex had 2 state-of-the-art band mills, which use a continuous steel blade, much more efficient than old circular saws. They paired that with dry kilns and a planer mill. A second mill opened in 1905 with another bandsaw and a Wicks gang mill, which uses multiple parallel blades to saw several boards at once.
What did that mean in terms of daily volume?
Together, the 2 pine mills could produce 250,000 board feet per 10-hour shift. It's an immense amount of wood, the equivalent of 15 rail cars of finished boards. That's from about 35 acres of forest every single day. And then the smaller hardwood mill added another 50,000 board feet on top of that.
To feed that machine, they had to build a logging infrastructure that could just conquer the wilderness.
They immediately adopted railroad logging, techniques they imported from the Great Lakes region. This meant laying down this huge temporary network of spur lines, usually spaced about a quarter-mile apart, that radiated out from the main rail lines.
And getting the logs onto those cars evolved pretty quickly, from muscle to steam.
Yeah, the first method was this slow, labor-intensive thing called cross-hauling. You'd use horses or oxen to pull chains over the flat car to roll the logs up. It was cheap, but it was way too slow to keep up with the mill's appetite. So they quickly moved to faster, steam-powered car-top loaders that could just hoist these massive logs and drop them onto the cars.
They also set up these surprisingly sophisticated remote logging camps.
They did. The camp at Shamanihopt Creek is a great example. It stayed in one permanent spot for 14 years, which was really unusual. This allowed the company to build actual houses, not just tents or shacks. They had running water, electric lights until 10 p.m., a YMCA, schools, and a big company store that could even make ice, which was a huge luxury. It was clear Crossett was raising the bar for labor, even in its most remote spots.
And this is where the story shifts from just industry to something more like sociology, this Crossett bubble. It was a textbook example of corporate paternalism.
It really was, designed for efficiency, but also, for a kind of stability that was almost unheard of.
The sources describe it pretty bluntly. Cap Gates ran the town like a plantation. For the first 46 years, the company owned everything. And the key detail is that no land was ever sold to the residents. They were all tenants.
That absolute control was the engine of the whole system. It wasn't about making money from rent. It was about social engineering. The company openly said this model ensured that radical labor leaders, riffraff, and other undesirables were barred. The thinking was, if we provide everything, lights, sewage, cheap housing, firewood, we get a stable, efficient, and a disciplined workforce.
But didn't the workers resent that? I mean, a complete lack of individual land ownership, especially in America. It sounds less like welfare and more like, corporate feudalism.
And that is the absolute core tension of the Crossett model. They sacrificed that civic independence that comes with owning land, but in return, the company provided the security blanket. The best example of this paradox is the Crossett Mercantile Company, or the commissary.
The commissary. Tell us more about that. It was the true social hub, right?
It was enormous, and it was the center of everything. It was painted that standard uniform Crossett gray, just like every other building. It was widely called the best store in all of Southeast Arkansas. It had everything from fine clothing to fertilizer. It was the Saturday meeting place for the entire county. The telephone exchange was upstairs for years.
And its credit system was the ultimate tool for control, but also a safety net, especially during hard times.
Absolutely. The system was a form of social insurance. People bought goods with company scripts, sometimes called bronzes, which were tokens only good at the commissary. You had a running line of credit, and you were famously never sent a bill. If you were in debt at the end of the year, especially during the Depression, they just gave you another year to catch up.
So families couldn't starve, but it also meant they could never really save enough to leave the system.
It was a very binding contract. You were protected from the ups and downs of the national economy. We have Depression-era prices like a 24-pound sack of flour for 35 cents, bacon for 7 cents a pound, but that stability came at the price of being financially tied to the company forever. You traded risk for total dependence.
And beyond just survival, the company built these impressive facilities to attract important visitors, which really established the town's social hierarchy. The Rose Inn is a perfect example.
The Rose Inn was a statement piece built after an earlier hotel burned down. Cap Gates, whose wife was Rose Cambrew Gates, privately named the 3-story building after her. It was built from the finest pine lumber, painted green, and designed as high-end accommodation for company execs, visitors, and important salesmen from Chicago and New York.
And the luxury was pretty unexpected for a remote sawmill town.
It was shockingly lavish. The dining room served high-end food, steak, every single night, and was famous for its hot biscuits. The waiters wore formal black jackets. But the inn had this really complex social function. The second floor was for the executives and travelers. The third floor, though, housed unmarried mill workers and, crucially, the town's teachers.
The teachers living there, so it was
Well,
like a high-end co-ed dorm.
Exactly. A teacher might pay $30 a month for room and board, sharing a room. It was how the company attracted and kept good educational talent. Tragically, though, that fine pine construction made it a tinderbox. It burned down quickly on a Sunday night in 1913.
So the inn defined the social hierarchy, but the physical rhythm of the town belonged to the sawmill whistle.
The mill whistle was the town clock. It wasn't just one blast, it was a ring of 4 whistles that blew in unison. It regulated work shifts, town curfews, even church services. But here's the profound community aspect. If someone got lost in the woods, the whistle would blow these long, regular blasts, acting as a beacon to help them find their way home.
The Crossett Hospital also shows that comprehensive commitment, especially given how dangerous the work was.
The hospital, which later became Ashley Memorial, was hugely important. It was the only real medical facility between Pine Bluff and Monroe, Louisiana. In the early days, it was mostly for industrial trauma sawmill accidents, burn victims, since minor sickness was handled at home, and the companies subsidized it heavily. The pricing was incredibly cheap. A family plan was $5.70 a month. A major abdominal operation cost just $100.
This is maybe the most unique part of the Crossett story. The typical lumber industry model in the South was cut out and get out, just leave devastation behind. But Crossett actively rejected that path and became a pioneer of scientific management.
In the beginning, they were no different. The early managers believed that once you cut the virgin timber, the land was pretty much worthless for a second growth. The company's first attempts to use all that cutover land were actually trying to get into farming and livestock.
And those attempts failed completely.
Total failures. The thin pine soils are great for growing pine trees fast, but they're terrible for sustained agriculture. The land just couldn't support commercial farming or cattle, so the company was left with these massive, unproductive, and seemingly worthless tracts of land.
So what was the big revelation that sparked the shift from basically mining the forest to farming it?
It was a realization driven by outside proof and financial necessity. Crossett officials were watching the pioneering reforestation work being done by Henry Hartner in Louisiana as early as 1916. They became convinced that long-term reforestation was not only practical, but much more economical. It was cheaper than constantly buying new tracts of virgin timber. That's when Cap Gates made his famous declaration. The forest must be treated as a crop. That was the turning point.
And that new philosophy led to serious research and long-term planning, a massive undertaking for a company town.
It was a monumental commitment. They set up the Crossett Research Center and the Crossett Experimental Forest, and even started a research partnership with Yale University. To get it all started, they partnered with the federal government. One of the first big projects used the Civilian Conservation Corps boys from the Hamburg camp.
What were the CCC boys actually doing out there?
They were building the fundamental infrastructure for forestry. They surveyed boundary lines, cut fire lines to protect the young trees, drilled wells for fire suppression, and they did a meticulous 100% inventory of the new experimental forest. That inventory was critical. It let the foresters calculate the current stock and project future growth with incredible accuracy.
And all that data is what ushered in the era of selective cutting.
Absolutely. They completely abandoned the clear-cutting model. They adopted a system refined by a forest scientist named R.R. Reynolds called selective cutting. This meant going in and marking the poles, the most valuable trees, the ones with the most growth potential, and designating which trees had to stay to seed the next generation. Only then did the loggers come in. They were treating timber not as a mine, but as a renewable crop, ensuring the forest always increased in value.
And the need to operate continuously, also drove new technology, especially for dealing with the wet Arkansas winters.
The winter was a huge bottleneck. Log skidding was originally done with horses, mules, and oxen, and they just got bogged down in the mud. The solution was the first use of Caterpillar tractors for skidding. These machines ran on tracks so they could pull logs all year round no matter how muddy it got. It solved a major industrial problem.
Meanwhile, one of the most famous symbols of Crossett's power was that massive tall smokestack.
It was an institution, a brick and concrete stack that was 274 feet high. It was built in the early days to create a powerful natural draft for the boilers before electric fans were common. You could see it for miles. It was this permanent beacon of industrial might on the horizon.
But maintaining a structure that tall must have been a nightmare.
It became prohibitively expensive. The sources say it cost between $7,000 and $8,000 a year just to change the aircraft beacon light at the top. Because of those costs, it was finally dynamited by Georgia Pacific in 1978, the end of an era.
But the real genius of the Crossett model was its radical industrial diversification, using every single part of the tree so nothing went to waste.
It was total systematic utilization. The paper mill, established in 1937, created a market for all the smaller logs and wood chips the sawmills couldn't use. Then they moved into chemicals.
What kind of chemicals can you get from wood waste?
The chemical company, from 1931, was very innovative. During charcoal distillation, they extracted things like wood alcohol and glacial acetic acid. They also salvaged sulfuric acid from paper mill waste and started marketing tall oil, which is crucial for soaps and adhesives. And finally, they built a massive plant to create particle board directly from mill waste sawdust, shavings, things that were previously just thrown away. That plant could produce 20,000 linear feet of board every day.
Despite this whole cradle-to-grave welfare system the company created, Crossett wasn't some kind of industrial utopia, was it?
Not at all. It was still subject to the same human struggles that were defining the broader American industrial landscape, from labor disputes to the slow march for social justice.
We mentioned the early wages were pretty low, starting at just 10 to 12 cents an hour. Even that high wage of $1.75 a day was still a low baseline. That must have created some discontent.
That tension was always there, and it boiled over into open conflict. It really signaled the slow decline of that absolute corporate paternalism. The biggest flashpoint came shortly after the paper mill expanded.
The 1940 strike. Tell us about that.
In 1940, workers in both the paper and sawmills went on a major strike, demanding better wages and, more importantly, better working conditions. The company just flatly refused their demands, and that led to a 2-month paralysis of the entire operation. Union organizers used traditional tactics, but the sources also say they used underhand tactics. And the striking workers, after 2 months with no pay, became desperate and even threatened to destroy company property.
And how did the company, which was so used to total control, respond to that organized resistance?
They leveraged their non-union workers.
Right.
The company sent in an official to lead a group of strikebreakers to actively defeat the union and end the strike, basically through force and intimidation. It showed the limits of paternalism. When challenged, the corporation reverted to harsh tactics to maintain control.
Shifting to social progress, the company's investment in education was significant. The first superintendent, D.C. Hastings, served for 39 years.
Right, and that foundation in education, surprisingly, led to a relatively peaceful transition during the Civil Rights era, a time that tore other Southern communities apart. Now, black and white residents lived on segregated sides of town, but the company never allowed the really harsh, systematic discrimination you saw elsewhere.
And they specifically made sure the facilities for black education were high quality.
Critically so. The facilities at the African-American T.W. Daniels School were comparable to the white schools in Crossett, and often better than schools in surrounding towns. That intentional investment really reduced the friction when integration finally came.
So how did integration actually happen in a town run by a company, not by a city council?
The sources say that because the company was the ultimate authority, when the order was given to integrate, the company just said no segregation. It was done quickly and completely. There were no major civil disturbances like you saw elsewhere in Arkansas. The superintendent at the time, Hugh Willis, famously told his teachers, "It is not a question, should it be done? We are just going to do it." That centralized authority meant immediate compliance.
The industrial setting of Crossett even generated its own unique folklore, blending romance and tragedy with the town's railroad history, the legend of the Crossett Light.
The Crossett Light is a classic American ghost story. It's this eerie glow seen on the Missouri Pacific tracks near town, and it became a destination for young people, for romance. The legend says the light is the ghost of a brakeman named David who was killed by a train as his sweetheart, Rosemarie, ran to meet him. His lantern is said to still patrol the line.
And it's supposed to have some kind of magical powers related to love.
That's the story. Many people claim it has this powerful matchmaking effect. Our sources have this great anecdote about a busload of youth from a Louisiana Baptist church who made a pilgrimage to see the light. Their pastor later reported that he performed more weddings the following month than in his entire previous pastorate, and he jokingly attributed it to the light.
And finally, the sources paint a really sharp picture of early Ashley County justice. It was swift and often brutal.
The county records confirm a stark, immediate frontier justice. The Ashley County Eagle from January 1900 describes a man named Glennie Bays who murdered his employer. He was found hiding in a well and was, quote, lynched at Crossett before cooler heads had a chance to intervene. That phrase says everything about the lack of due process.
And even in the planned company town, the laws were incredibly strict.
Tightly enforced. Crossett was a dry town from its founding. Early laws banned cruelty to animals like cockfighting and strictly forbade carrying concealed weapons. If you maimed someone with a weapon, the fine could be $1,000 or a year in jail. A clear attempt to bring harsh, immediate order to the industrial camp.
While Crossett offers this unique story of industrial paternalism, Drew County gives us the broader context of commerce and education that shaped the whole region.
Exactly. We need to give that area the depth it deserves.
Monticello was set up as Drew County's seat in 1849, and it developed this diverse economy based on government, commerce, and agriculture.
Monticello's real strength became its reputation as the region's intellectual center. It prioritized institutions early on. By the 1850s, it had Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches. And that commitment led to the founding of the State Agricultural School in 1909.
And that agricultural school was the anchor for the town's future, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It provided crucial vocational and technical training for the region's families, and it eventually became the University of Arkansas at Monticello, UAM. That cemented Monticello's role as the educational hub, a real contrast to Crossett's purely corporate identity.
Wilmar offers another interesting snapshot of the timber boom economy that came before Crossett's permanent model.
Wilmar was a vital rail junction and mill town. It was a classic boom town, shipping out cotton and corn, but mostly timber, connecting the deep forest to national markets.
And it also had an academic focus for a while.
It did. It hosted Beauvoir College for a time. And even after that closed around 1907, Wilmar continued the legacy with a really strong public high school. By 1907, it had an 11th-grade curriculum, which was quite rigorous for a small town back then.
And finally, we have to look at the efforts toward Black educational independence in the Delta region of Drew County.
Yes, Dermott is a hugely significant example. It nurtured this resilient, self-sustaining Black community with its own businesses and physicians by the 1880s, and that spirit went straight into education.
Tell us about Morris Booker Memorial College.
The Southeast Baptist Academy was founded there in 1899. By Black Baptist associations who saw the urgent need for local secondary education. That academy evolved into the highly respected Morris Booker Memorial College by 1934, offering both high school and junior college courses. It gained a statewide reputation for academic excellence, all thanks to community and religious support when public resources were so limited.
And what was the experience in smaller Delta communities, like Selma?
Education in Selma was supported by things like the Rosenwald schools, which were vital. But as agriculture became less labor-intensive, families often moved to larger towns like Dermott or Monticello for better opportunities, so those smaller community schools eventually had to consolidate or close.
We've covered this dramatic transformation from a rugged, water-defined wilderness into this highly organized industrial society. It's so clear that the history of this region really is like loblolly pine's growth rings. You have that inner core of harsh pioneer survival and frontier justice, and then these outer layers of complex, scientific, and meticulously planned corporate growth.
Exactly. The Crossett story in particular is just a sociological masterclass. It shows this intense tension between absolute corporate control and genuine long-term welfare for employees. Their vision provided generations with stability schools, hospitals, jobs, where other companies just saw resources to extract and abandon. And their dedication to sustainability, driven by that revolutionary idea that the forest was a crop, fundamentally secured the region's economic future.
So what does this all mean for the legacy of stability and independence in the region today?
It raises a really important question. When a corporate entity acts as a total patron, providing everything from schools to credit during the Depression, they create an invaluable safety net. But you have to ask, at what point does that guaranteed security conflict with the fundamental American desire for individual economic and civic independence? For the people of Crossett, for nearly 50 years, the company made virtually every decision. They traded a volatile frontier life for extraordinary, but also deeply limiting stability.
A truly provocative thought for you to mull or explore on your own. Consider the modern implications of a world where economic permanence like Crossett's planned, sustainable 500,000-acre timber base is achieved by sacrificing traditional land ownership and local civic freedom for generations. What is the true cost of security?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're heading into the dense, pine-covered history of southern Arkansas, a place that, pioneers in the 19th century just called the Great Wilderness.
Right. And deep in that wilderness is this incredible story of a town built from scratch and the industrial titan who willed it into existence.
Our mission today is to really unpack the vision of Edgar Woodward Cap Gates. He's the man behind the town of Crossett.
And this is more than just a local history story. It's really a study of this tension between ambition and the idea of permanence.
Because the standard model back then, especially in the South, was temporary. It was all cut out and get out logging.
Exactly. You take the resources, you move on, and you leave nothing but stumps behind.
But Gates just flat out rejected that.
He did. And we're going to dig into the sources to understand how his personal drive, which was forged by a literal physical catastrophe, let him create a permanent modern town on a landscape that has this incredibly deep ecological history. We're talking about the Ouarkita and Saline River systems. This place was built to last.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself, Cap Gates. Born in Iowa, 1866. The sources describe him as having this restless ambition from a very young age.
Yeah, but the sheer grit that really defined him, that was forged way outside of Arkansas. It happened in the copper mines of Colorado.
And this is the defining event of his entire life.
Absolutely. He was only 17 years old. He's working in a mine, and there's a dynamite explosion. The sources are pretty unflinching about how bad it was.
He lost the sight in his right eye.
Completely. And his left eye was severely damaged.
Yeah.
I mean, for almost anyone else, that's it. Your career's over.
Yeah.
But for Gates, this was just the beginning.
It's fascinating how he processed that. He became known as the one-eyed titan, but he never let it become a story of tragedy.
No, he absolutely refused to see it as a calamity. His reaction, and this really tells you everything about his character, was to treat the injury not as some kind of limitation, but as a challenge to his best effort.
So he just doubled down.
He doubled down. That moment cemented his reputation for sheer tenacity. It's the engine that drove everything later. He sort of decided that if he couldn't rely on his physical sight, he'd have to rely completely on his foresight.
And that drive brings him south to Arkansas in 1886. I love that he really did start at the very bottom.
Oh, yeah. A fireman at a sawmill in Thornton. And then over the next 10 years or so, he just works his way up, promotion after promotion, learning every single part of the business from the inside.
Which is how he positions himself to finally launch his own thing.
And that is exactly where his personal ambition just slams headfirst into the old social structure of southern Arkansas.
So he's got the land picked out.
He does. He secures an option on this huge 47,000-acre tract of virgin pine. He has the investors, mostly from the north. He just needs a town to operate out of, and the logical choice is Hamburg, the county seat.
But Hamburg's leaders, they wanted absolutely nothing to do with him.
Not a thing.
Yeah.
And this rejection is, it's the reason Crossett even exists. It was a really dramatic conflict. The leaders in Hamburg were, very protective of their way of life.
Which was mostly agricultural.
Right. Based on agriculture and very traditional structures.
Right.
The sources point to two big fears that drove their decision to just shut him down.
Okay, let's break those down.
So first, they were openly against what they called foreign sawmill people.
Which is code for Northerners.
It's code for the Iowa and Northern money that was backing Gates. They were afraid of losing their political and economic influence to these outsiders.
And the second fear?
The second one was maybe even more fundamental. They were worried about him disrupting their local labor market.
Meaning he was going to pay more.
Exactly. The whole local economy depended on a cheap, available African-American labor force that was tied to the farming cycle. Gates coming in with higher, industrial wages.
Mm.
Well, that threatened to pull all that labor away. It could destabilize their entire economic system.
So they saw him as a threat, not as progress.
A major threat.
So how does the One-Eyed Titan respond to being told no?
With pure defiance. He doesn't go away quietly. He vows retaliation. He says he's going to build his own town, and I'm quoting here, "Not a damned minute later than I have to," right on a nearby piece of land that was known as a deer stand.
And that's Crossett, just born out of pure spite and determination.
And the beginning in 1899 was just unbelievably raw. It started as Tent City.
Wow.
It's hard to even picture the logistics. They were dragging massive boilers and saws on sleds through miles of knee-deep mud just to get to the site.
So when they finally start cutting lumber,
When that mill starts running on May 17, 1899, that first batch of wood isn't sold for profit. They immediately use it for siding, turning those canvas tents into slightly more permanent canvas-topped houses.
building a town with the very first thing the town produces.
Its creation born out of total necessity.
And once the town is literally nailed together, Gates moves fast to establish control. He's not building a democracy here. He's building what the sources call the Crossett bubble.
It's the classic company town, but run under his very strict version of golden rule paternalism. He had total control. The sources say he was the town's policeman, prosecutor, judge, and jury.
So if you stepped out of line, you were out.
Immediately.
Yeah.
If you were considered an undesirable, a gambler, a drunkard, you were just told to pick up his pay and be on his way. No appeal. Gates's word was law.
This obsession with moral control leads to my favorite anecdote from the sources, the 24-hour church miracle.
Oh, it's the best. It perfectly shows how he would just use sheer force of will to get around any obstacle.
Yeah.
So he hears someone's planning to open a saloon in town.
Which to him is a bigger threat than dynamite, apparently.
Precisely. So to block it legally, he finds this obscure state law that says you can't sell alcohol within, I think it was a mile, of a house of worship.
So what does he do?
He doesn't petition anyone. He just orders the construction crew to drop everything they're doing.
And they work all night.
All through the night.
Yeah.
Hauling timber, framing walls. They build a small, simple church. The whole thing cost about $75.
$75. That's amazing.
And in less than 24 hours, it's standing. It's a house of worship. They use it to trigger the law, and Crossett has never had a legal saloon. That dry legacy lasts to this day.
The sheer will to build a whole building overnight just to stop a bar from opening it's just incredible.
But you know, this paternalism wasn't just about control. Gates knew that if he wanted the town to be permanent, he had to make it a place people actually wanted to live. He had to offer a better quality of life.
So what made the Crossett bubble so attractive to workers and their families?
Well, for one, he built the Rose Inn, which is a beautiful hotel and kind of a social center for the whole community. He named it after his wife, Rose Kinnebrew.
That's a nice touch. Humanizes him a bit.
It does. And more practically, he demanded a first-class school system. Now, this was the segregated South, but the sources do point out that the facilities built for the African-American community, like the T.W. Daniel School, were built to a very high standard, far better than what was available elsewhere in the rural South.
And then there was the infrastructure, the stuff that just didn't exist for most people back then.
Absolutely. This is key. By 1904, Crossett has electricity and running water. You have to remember, for rural America, this is a full generation before those things became common.
I read that they even had a routine for the lights.
They did. They'd blink the town lights at 10:55 p.m. every single night, which was the signal that the power was shutting off at 11 Siverdal. Everything was managed. Everything was precise.
So you have this dictator, really, but one who is also incredibly forward-thinking. And that brings us to his most revolutionary idea, the one that really secured the town's future.
This is the core of his legacy. As we said, the norm was timber mining. You clear-cut everything, you exhaust the resource, and you leave. It was a model that created ghost towns.
But Gates was all about perpetuity. He was playing the long game.
He was one of the first and certainly most aggressive adopters of what's called sustained yield forestry. It was a concept that was almost alien in the South at the time, a huge intellectual leap.
So how did he actually do it? How do you make forestry perpetual?
He relied on science. In a really incredible move, he formed a partnership with the Yale School of Forestry.
Yay!
Yale. As early as 1912, he brought professional foresters and scientists down to Arkansas to manage the entire operation.
So what did the scientists have them do differently?
The first big change was they stopped clear cutting, period. They moved to selective cutting, which meant they only harvested mature trees. specifically trees that were 14 inches in diameter or more.
So you're just harvesting the crop that's ready.
Exactly. But the second part was the most important for the future. For every area they harvested, they had to leave at least 2 large, healthy trees standing.
And why was that?
Those were the seed trees. They were left there specifically to naturally reseed the land they had just cut. They were guaranteeing the next forest.
So he really did see the forest as a farm, not as a mine to be emptied.
That's the perfect way to put it. He saw it as a crop to be farmed. And then they integrated everything. They built paper mills and chemical plants to use every last scrap of the tree. Nothing was wasted.
That model must have been what saved them during the rough economic times.
It was their lifeline. Because they weren't just selling lumber. This diverse scientific model let the whole town, the whole operation, survive the Great Depression. While other mill towns went under, the Crossett bubble, it stayed afloat.
It's easy to see him as just this industrial machine, but the sources give us a look at his personal side, too. He wasn't all business all the time.
No, not at all. He was a huge baseball fan. He actually organized the town's first team himself, and was so into it, he once took the entire team on a trip to Colorado to play exhibition games.
He was investing in morale and community?
Yes. And his passion for farming went beyond trees. He got into livestock.
With the same scientific approach.
You bet. He started the Crossett Hampshire Club and the Gates Cattle Farm, breeding superior stock, and then sharing that know-how with local farmers to help them do better. It was all part of the same integrated vision.
Cap Gates died in Crossett in 1935. He lived to see his tent city become the forestry capital of the South.
He did. And his memory is still there, in symbols like the rose window in the church, and more importantly, in those huge sustainable forests that still surround the town. Now, the company was eventually bought by Georgia-Pacific, and that brought new changes, new uncertainties. But the foundation Gates built, it's proven to be remarkably strong.
So if you put it all together, Cap Gates really was the master gear of the whole Crossett machine. He was scarred, hardened by those mines, but his vision provided the precise torque needed to turn a muddy wilderness into this smoothly running permanent society.
A society that kept running long after he was gone. And that story of industrial permanence is so powerful. But that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, and it comes from looking even deeper into the sources.
Right, because we mentioned this land has a history of permanence that goes back way further than industry.
Way further. The sources remind us about the ancient history here. We know about the Baytown culture, for example, which was thriving on Big Mound Ridge around 550 AD. This was a complex society that survived massive climate shifts and huge floods from the Ouachita River.
And they managed that permanence not by controlling the environment, but by adapting to it.
Exactly. They built on natural high ground, they practiced horticulture, they built these huge communal mounds. Their permanence was rooted in geology and cosmology. It was a careful negotiation with the power of the river.
So the question this whole deep dive leaves us with is this. What stands out to you as the truer form of permanence? Is it reshaping the land through industrial power, like the one-eyed titan Cap Gates did? Or is it accepting the limits and the rhythms of the water and living in harmony with them, the way the ancient people of this basin learned to do thousands of years before? Welcome to a deep dive into an absolutely fascinating and, frankly, a pretty unique chapter of American industrial history. For this deep dive, we are heading deep into the pinelands of Ashley County, Arkansas, to the community of Crossett.
Crossett is a story that really stands in sharp contrast to the typical 19th century resource extraction narrative.
Right, the cut out and get out model.
Exactly. For decades, that was the dominant model in the South. Lumber companies would come in, strip the land, and just leave behind ghost towns and desolate fields.
But Crossett was different?
Crossett was intentionally designed to defy that. It eventually even earned the moniker the forestry capital of the South.
So our mission today is to really take a magnifying glass to the first 50 years of Crossett's existence, say, from its founding in 1899 all the way through 1949.
Yeah.
And we're going to use the town's founder, Edgar Woodward Cap Gates, as the connecting tissue, sort of the spline that links the local phenomenon of the Crossett bubble to all the massive changes sweeping the nation.
And what's really essential to understand from the very beginning is that Crossett acts as this critical case study.
In what way?
We're watching the collision between a short-term extraction economy and the emerging long-term sustainable management economy. Everything there was what you call an imposed industrial fiat.
Meaning everything was dictated by the company.
Every single decision,
Mm.
down to the paint color, the
Yeah.
lot size, even the style of the roofs, it was all for the sake of long-term permanence and, control.
Okay, let's unpack this history. And there is no better place to start than with the founder himself,
Cap Gates.
Cap Gates. Born in Iowa in 1866, but the sources make it very clear that his core character was forged not in the Midwest, but in the brutal, chaotic, hard rock mining districts of Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
He carried some serious physical and psychological scars from the West. What happened there that was so formative for him?
The event that changed everything for him was a catastrophic industrial accident.
And he wasn't management at this point.
Not at all. He was a common laborer in a mine where safety standards were basically non-existent. A massive explosion struck, most likely caused by unstable dynamite, which was incredibly common back then.
And the result was devastating to his sight.
Completely devastating. I mean, the injury cost him the total sight of one eye and most of the vision in the other.
Wow.
He was left with only a tiny fraction of his sight. For a manual laborer, that should have been it. Game over.
But it wasn't.
No, it became a catalyst.
He retreated back to Ohio to recover, but instead of just giving up on industry, he dives right back in. How did that personal, visceral experience of chaos shape his leadership later on?
It created an almost, you could say, a pathological need to impose absolute order on any environment he controlled.
Because he'd seen the alternative.
He had experienced the ultimate consequence of careless systems. So when he later became a leader in the South, that trauma manifested as this demanding but intensely paternalistic style. He was obsessed with the welfare and organization of his workers.
Not just because it was the right thing to do.
Not just that, but because it was the only way to minimize the chaos he knew could destroy an operation and a man in an instant.
It's so interesting that even after all his success in the humid, flat Delta, his heart was still in the Rockies. He kept that land near Crossett, Colorado, the Gates camp.
Absolutely. The Lodge of the Pines Guest Ranch. It was a crucial sanctuary for him, a place to get away from the noise and humidity of the mill. And that connection is still there today.
How so?
The land was later donated to the Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Denver. So there's this multi-generational link between the Gates family and the West.
So this need for order defined him. But where did he decide to impose that order? It wasn't in the established town of Hamburg, which was his first choice, right?
That's right. The Crossett Lumber Company, capitalized by E.S. Crossett, Dr. J.W. Watzek, and the Gates brothers, they bought this massive 50,000-acre timber tract in 1898.
And they wanted to build their mill in Hamburg.
And that's where the defining conflict, the Hamburg rejection, happened. The local business community there, who were all rooted in the old agrarian economy, cotton, farm labor, they flat out refused to sell land to Gates.
And why? Why block the region's biggest industrial project?
Well, they were afraid it would disrupt their, quote, genteel social order.
Meaning they were worried about transient workers, gamblers.
All of that. But the real reason, the one underneath it all, was they feared the industrial competition. Gates' company was going to offer industrial wages, maybe $1.50, $1.75 a day.
Which was a huge step up from farm labor wages.
Precisely. The agrarian elite knew this would immediately drain their workforce, especially the African-American laborers who were essential to the cotton economy. They saw Crossett as a direct threat to their control.
So, faced with this blockade, Gates, true to form, just says,
He says he'll build his own town.
just like that.
He and Judge Lachula, they go out and pick a spot that was locally known as a great deer stand near a place called Coffee Creek.
And the site was chosen for purely practical reasons, I assume.
Purely industrial pragmatism. It was on a natural high ridge, which meant great drainage, which is vital in the Delta. And Coffee Creek gave them the water source they could dam to create the mill pond.
Which you absolutely need for the logs.
They have to have it.
That initial period must have been incredibly rough. We're talking about the winter of 1898, 1899. The first engineers and sawyers lived in what they called Tent City.
And the sources call the local clay an impassable quagmire. That shared hardship really became the town's unifying origin myth.
You can just imagine it.
Oh, yeah. Hauling massive mill machinery overland with ox teams through that thick clay, that collective struggle, it just instantly forged this communal, purpose-driven identity.
So once they move from tents to permanent houses, the whole identity of the Crossett bubble starts to take physical shape.
Yes, every house painted Crossett gray, a cheap, lead-based paint, total uniformity.
But the defining architectural feature, the thing you see in all the old photos, is the standardized hip roof. Why that specific design?
It was pure structural engineering dictated by the climate.
Okay.
Southeast Arkansas is very prone to severe storms, high winds. A hip roof, which slopes down on all four sides, is just aerodynamically superior to a standard gable roof. It offers much greater stability.
So it's about protecting the company's assets, the houses, and the workers inside them.
Exactly. But it was also about comfort, before air conditioning.
The ventilation.
Critically important. The hip roof allowed for continuous eaves on all four sides. That shades the walls, the windows, and it helps pull hot air up and out of the home. A natural cooling system.
Here's where the architectural history gets really nuanced. This design wasn't just invented on the spot for Crossett.
No, not at all. That standardization was based on knowledge brought by migratory labor. As the timber on the Atlantic coast was exhausted in places like Georgia, the Carolina skilled carpenters moved west for work.
And they brought their building styles with them.
They brought their architectural DNA. The hip-roofed cottage with a big front porch is a staple of the South Carolina Lowcountry vernacular. It's sometimes called the pyramidal cottage. Crossett just took that traditional form and industrialized it for mass production.
And this standardization was central to the corporate urbanism Gates imposed. The town is laid out on a rigid grid with these incredibly wide streets.
100 feet for the main avenues, yeah. And while the layout was strictly segregated, you had silk stocking row for management, separate quarters for laborers. The amenities themselves were revolutionary for that area.
That's the core appeal of the Crossett bubble, isn't it?
It is. The company provided a quality of life far superior to the surrounding rural chaos. You had company-generated electricity, running water, a sewage system, things unheard of in small Arkansas towns then.
A planned community.
A completely planned community, later formalized by the Bartholomew Plan, which set up zoning and a path for the company to eventually transfer ownership.
So you have this isolated community deep in the woods, built by corporate decree. How did people stay connected to the outside world? The sources really point to the radio.
The radio was everything. The Mills power plant meant they had rural electrification early, so by the 1930s, families could gather around these plug-in sets. The radio became the electronic hearth, piercing the isolation of the forest.
And what were they tuning into?
The regional giants. You had KTHS in Hot Springs, a massive cultural beacon, and the very birthplace of the comedy show Lum and Abner.
Which must have resonated so powerfully given that Lum and Abner was set in fictional Pine Ridge, Arkansas.
It was total cultural validation. The show reflected their rural reality. It used their vernacular. It affirmed their existence on a national stage. Then you had KWKH in Shreveport, a 50,000-watt powerhouse.
The Louisiana Hayride.
The Louisiana Hayride, giving them that crucial link to country and hillbilly music.
Yeah.
And so important for the African-American community. KFFA in Helena started broadcasting King Biscuit Time in 1941, bringing Delta blues right into their homes.
So you have this rich soundscape coming in. But the community also developed its own folklore, didn't it? The Crossett Light.
It's the perfect ghost story for a town like this.
Tell us about it.
The Crossett Light is this floating orb seen along the railroad tracks or deep in the woods. The stories say it's the ghostly lantern of a decapitated brakeman, or maybe just swamp gas.
But either way, it ties the town's identity to its two essential elements.
The railroad, the industrial artery, and the dark forest. The resource. It's a perfect encapsulation.
That folklore was born in the era of extraction, but that era was coming to an end. By the 1920s, the South is facing a huge crisis. Millions of acres of just desolate, cut-over land. And Gates faced that same choice: liquidate or reinvent the company for permanence.
And they chose a truly revolutionary path. This is what sets Crossett apart. They knew their future was finite under the old model, so they partnered with the Yale University School of Forestry.
As far back as 1912.
Way back in 1912. The company's huge timberlands basically became a living laboratory for Yale students and researchers.
Which leads directly to the Crossett experiment.
Right. Officially established in 1933 with R.R. Reynolds from the U.S. Forest Service, it was a direct rebuttal to the industry wisdom of the day.
Which was that second growth pine was essentially worthless.
Practically worthless, they called it.
Yeah.
Prone to warping, too low density. The experiment's goal was to prove you could manage that timber into a premium perpetual crop.
And Reynolds develops the technique that changes everything: the selection method.
It was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of clear cutting, Reynolds implemented selective cutting. They'd harvest only the mature trees.
And leave the smaller, younger ones to keep growing?
Exactly. It guaranteed a perpetual harvest. It fundamentally shifted the whole concept of timber from being a finite mine to an eternally renewable crop.
That foresight immediately justified huge long-term investments in the town. They didn't just stop at lumber.
Not at all. They built the chemical plant in 1931 to distill wood alcohol and charcoal from hardwood waste that used to be just burned or left to rot.
And then the big one.
The massive Kraft paper mill in 1937, designed specifically to use pine thinnings and waste chips. This kind of vertical integration made Crossett a global mecca for foresters. It proved conservation and industry could coexist.
Now let's see how that system held up against the biggest shock of the century, the Great Depression.
Right.
Arkansas was devastated, but inside the Crossett bubble there was a degree of protection.
A huge degree. The defining element was the no-layoff policy, which Cap Gates maintained until he retired in '35. Instead of mass firings, the company just reduced operating hours.
So everyone worked less, but everyone kept their job.
Everyone kept their job. Paychecks were smaller, but the core workforce was protected. Families didn't starve or lose their company housing.
And the company commissary, the company stow, that became a lifeline when the banks failed.
It basically functioned as a parallel economy. When cash disappeared, the company issued scrip, or just extended credit at the commissary.
Which we should note is a system that's often criticized for creating golden handcuffs.
Oh, absolutely. It's a form of debt peonage. When the company is your only landlord and the commissary is your only store, and they control the currency, you don't have a lot of freedom.
You're tied to the job.
You're tied to the job. But during the absolute chaos of the Depression, that stable controlling mechanism often meant the difference between having a roof over your head and complete starvation.
But that tight paternalistic grip, it had to crack eventually. Even with the huge demand from World War II, the workers start to see themselves as separate from the company.
The 1940 lumber strike is the first clear signal of that. It was the defining break in that psychological contract.
The first step toward modern labor relations.
And away from the whole company as parent model. It showed the workforce no longer saw their interests as perfectly aligned with the company's.
And the final piece of this transition happens just after the war in 1946.
That was the historic divestiture. The Crossett Lumber Company begins the process of turning a company town into a real civic entity.
Selling the houses to the employees.
Selling the houses, transferring responsibility for municipal services, water, sewer, police, to an incorporated city government, all guided by that Bartholomew Plan. The Crossett bubble officially became a real town. So we connect this to the bigger picture. Crossett's history really shows how these intensely personal forces like Cap Gates' trauma, the rejection by Hamburg, how they combined with groundbreaking science to create this industrial organism designed for permanence.
It's a real counter-narrative to the standard boom and bust story.
Unique one, yeah.
So what does this all mean? The history of Crossett, anchored by the vision of Cap Gates, it demonstrates that foresight and sustainable systems allowed one industrial community to endure far beyond the typical lifespan of its peers. It fundamentally transformed the South's relationship with its most important natural resource.
The company famously had a motto that nothing was wasted but the whisper of the pines. By developing the chemical and paper plants, they used every single scrap of waste material. So given that level of total industrial integration, where every single resource, including its own refuse, is monetized and repurposed by the same powerful corporate entity, what happens to the social and cultural identity of a community when that company effectively controls the entire ecosystem from cradle to grave?
That question of corporate control versus civic identity is a powerful one to consider as you reflect on your deep dive into the pine forests of Arkansas. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is really laser focused. We're tracing the incredible, and let's be honest, often brutal history of a very specific corner of South Arkansas.
That's right.
We're taking the sources you provided and charting this region's evolution from what was basically written off as the Great Wilderness.
Right, an uninhabitable swamp.
To becoming this highly structured, almost scientifically designed industrial society built built entirely on the value of wood.
And this is a deep dive that's really defined by transformation. To get our heads around it, we've had to synthesize records that stretch across, what, 2 centuries?
At least.
We're looking at everything from the gritty realism you find in early 19th century county records,
Yeah.
and these powerful little snippets from the Ashley County Eagle newspaper.
The ones that survived, anyway.
The ones that survive. And we're pairing that with these detailed corporate histories that document the sudden birth of the company town of Crossett and its unique, and I mean world-altering shift in how forests were managed.
So for you, the listener, what you're about to hear is a narrative of extremes. It's a journey defined first by extreme physical hardship, high mortality rates, localized violence in that pioneer era.
A really tough existence.
Then it just pivots sharply into this massive, centralized industrial ambition. And finally, and this is the part I find fascinating, it reveals this surprising evolution of conservation efforts. A revolution that, and this is the critical part, was born not out of some grand idealism, but out of absolute stark financial necessity when the timber started to run out. So let's start by defining the supposedly impossible landscape.
Okay, so to really set the stage, we have to completely deconstruct that term, the Great Wilderness.
Right.
I mean, yes, the land was certainly forbidding and wild when the first European-American pioneers showed up in the 19th century. But that narrative, that idea of wilderness, it only applies to a very, very narrow slice of history.
Because people had been there for millennia.
Exactly. The reality is this geography had supported complex, highly organized human societies for thousands of years before any settlement we'd recognize.
Absolutely. Our sources prove that. Long before the Quapaw, long before the Europeans, you had people living these incredibly organized lives. We see profound evidence of this prehistoric complexity at sites like Watson Brake and the Big Mound Ridge.
Which fall into what archaeologists call the Baytown phase.
And that's an important distinction, isn't it?
It is, because the Baytown phase, which goes back well over 1,000 years, it marks this incredibly significant transition in the lower Mississippi Valley. This wasn't just simple nomadic hunting and gathering.
Yeah.
This was a move toward increased sedentariness and sophisticated earthwork building. The mounds at Big Mound Ridge, for instance, they contain burials.
Which tells you a lot.
It demonstrates a structured communal life, a clear social hierarchy, all centered in this supposedly impenetrable region.
And that complexity just keeps evolving right up to the point of European contact. We know that sites within the Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge, for example, show evidence of the later Mississippian era. I'm talking Caddo villages, more mounds, these vast ceremonial plazas.
And their economy was impressive. It was focused on intensive maize agriculture, which could sustain large populations, and crucially, they were involved in the salt trade.
Salt? That's a specialized commodity.
It is. The existence of a specialized trade good like salt suggests pretty extensive regional networks that stretched far beyond just the local river valley. I mean, this was a busy, complex hub of economic activity.
Yet fast forward to the 19th century, and it's instantly labeled the impenetrable frontier. So let's define the geography of the great wilderness that those early pioneers actually encountered.
Geographically, it was immense. It was, broadly defined as spanning from the sparse settlements near places like Columbia and Point Chico on the Mississippi River, and then stretching west all the way to the Ouachita and Marie Celine rivers.
And the whole region was dominated by the Bayou Bartholomew.
That's the one.
It feels like the Bayou Bartholomew is sort of the main character in this whole geographic drama. You mentioned it's more than just a simple river.
Oh, much more. Geologists have confirmed this. The Bayou Bartholomew is widely conjectured to be an ancient, or what they call a relict, channel of either the Arkansas River or maybe even the Mississippi itself.
And you can see the evidence on the ground.
It's right there in the landscape. It has these distinct double banks, which are geological features that are typically formed only by massive, slow-moving streams that consistently overflow and deposit heavy loads of silt over, extremely long periods of time.
So something must have changed its course.
Almost certainly. Its current meandering path was likely altered by major geological disturbances. The most likely culprit is the intense New Madrid earthquake series of 1811 to 1812,
Wow.
which literally shook the entire regional drainage patterns and probably warped the topography of the land itself.
So what did the first surveyors and explorers actually say about this warped, waterlogged land?
Their descriptions are, well, they're chillingly uniform, forbidding, desolate. You have to imagine a dense, almost tropical understory because of the constant overflow.
Right.
So you have these long, tangled grape and rattan vines just hanging everywhere in complete disorder. And then on the higher ground, huge blackened tree trunks, either lying broken or just standing dead, killed by fire or flood.
It sounds desolate not because it lacked life, but because it had the wrong kind of life for a settler.
Exactly. It was absolutely teeming with life you didn't want if you were trying to clear a farm. Abundant black mosquitoes, enormous rattlesnakes, and bears were just everywhere. The French, who came through much earlier, they even named landmarks based on this environment, like Chemanahoe Creek.
And this intense natural environment was still the home of the Quapaw Indians, the downstream people, whose legacy was, well, it was almost immediately swept away.
The Quapaw territory was huge. It stretched from the Arkansas Post south toward the Waukita River. And we know that under Spanish colonial rule, administrators like a Don Juan Fihil, who governed the Waukita district, they were actually instructed to maintain harmonious relations.
Which suggests, what? An uneasy coexistence.
Exactly. It was a period of uneasy coexistence, but it was fundamentally temporary.
And the ultimate inevitable outcome was displacement to Oklahoma. But what's really fascinating, and I think it sets the stage for the corporate acquisition we'll discuss later, is the legal framework the U.S. government used to justify all this.
Oh, it established a devastating legal precedent for resource appropriation. The U.S. government maintained that the indigenous people held only occupation rights, not inherent transferable ownership of the land.
Which effectively meant the land was just there for the taking.
Precisely. Treaties were secured by distributing what were, at the end of the day, bribes. Gifts like guns, blankets, red handkerchiefs, handed out to the chieftains and warriors. So the government was, in effect, negotiating the relinquishment of territory that they never legally recognized the tribes truly owned in the first place.
An uneven, power-driven negotiation that cleared the way for the pioneers, and then eventually the loggers.
That's the one.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's transition from that geographic and legal blueprint to the human reality on the ground. We have these invaluable excerpts from the Ashley County Eagle.
The fragments.
The fragments that survived, yeah. And they paint a picture of a society that was living right on the knife's edge of survival. This was not the romanticized frontier. This was brutal.
They absolutely show the staggering human cost. When you look at the census data and the obituaries, say, from 1889 to 1907, the story is one of high mortality, especially among those who, held the family structure together. Life expectancy was terrifyingly short.
The frequent death of young mothers in childbirth just stands out.
Yeah.
I mean, we read about Mrs. Bell Duckworth dying in 1905 at just 36 years old. She leaves 4 young girls behind, having suffered from some unnamed disease for 2 agonizing years.
Heartbreaking.
Or the tragedy of Mrs. John D. Nutt, who died just before Christmas in 1900, leaving a young husband and 2 very young children. These weren't isolated incidents, were they? This was the norm.
This was the norm, and infant and child mortality was pervasive, often from these mysterious illnesses they just called congestion.
Which could be anything.
A blanket term for any number of respiratory or circulatory failures or, known killers like scarlet fever. And they faced the constant prevalence of swamp fever malaria, which just devastated communities every single summer. The necessity of life meant you work through these chronic illnesses, which often just led to an early death.
And that harsh reality really highlights the absolute necessity of skilled medical practitioners, as few and far between as they must have been.
Exactly. I mean, take a figure like Dr. Staton, a North Carolinian. The sources note that he had to pay 5 cents a day for his own school tuition. He was effectively making his own way in the world from the age of 9 just to pursue medicine.
These weren't privileged city-trained doctors.
Not at all. They were often self-made men providing essential services under the most challenging conditions imaginable.
But beyond disease, the social conflict was high stakes and often deadly. We see the justice system handling everything from really minor infractions to these lethal feuds.
Yeah.
It illustrates the quick, brutal nature of frontier lawlessness.
Yeah, you have the minor turmoil like A.J. Drake, the bigamist who got arrested, or a man named Hig Riley fined the ridiculously low sum of $1 for assault and battery.
$1.
It just shows you how arbitrary the system was. But the violence that was rooted in debt and property, that was far more terrifying.
The killing of James D. Stevens, who was a successful planter, by Glennie Bays, a black man living on his property, over an unpaid debt, is just a visceral example of this.
It is. Bays shot Stevens and then broke the gun over his head before fleeing. But what makes this incident so chilling is what happened next.
He was found hiding.
He was located, hiding in a well near the scene of his crime. And the sources state, and this is a direct quote, that he was put to death before cooler heads had a chance to intervene.
So he was lynched.
He was lynched at Crossett the following Thursday night. And this incident, it reveals the complete lack of a systemic, formal system of law in these isolated communities. Justice was swift, it was brutal, and it was often mob-driven. This environment of vigilante justice really defined the risk at the frontier.
And these feuds could span years or even generations.
Yeah.
The high-profile killing of B.A. Hardy, a prominent Monticello businessman, by John McVeigh on a train near Pine Bluff,
Yeah.
that illustrates this lingering bitterness.
Absolutely. McVeigh allegedly killed Hardy over an old cow dispute, a disagreement that was so intense that it had previously resulted in McVeigh's own leg being amputated a year earlier. The fact that an injury leading to amputation still wasn't enough to settle the score. It shows you how deeply personal and violent property lines and even minor grievances could become.
And yet, despite all this volatility and mortality, people found structure. The social anchors were incredibly important in binding these isolated communities together.
Fountain Hill played an essential early role. It served as the first unofficial county seat, and it operated a U.S. post office from 1846, initially when the area was still technically under Bradley County jurisdiction.
There's even a local legend about the Jackson family patriarch being born there.
That's right, Joseph Jackson. And the very first Drew County court was held nearby at a man named Alexander Rawls' cabin. So Fountain Hill was really the administrative core before the timber boom came and shifted everything.
And the social calendar was critical. These close-knit bonds were reinforced through these communal activities.
Yes, the sources highlight the absolute importance of what they call play parties. These were dances, large, often multi-family gatherings that just relieved the daily isolation.
A way to connect.
And summer church revivals were essential social occasions, too. They brought together members of various denominations for spirited singing and, lengthy sermons, things like box suppers, foot racing, singing bees. They all serve the crucial function of building necessary community resilience in the face of such relentless hardship.
Finally, we just have to acknowledge the intellectual tragedy here. The loss of the historical record itself. The fate of the Ashley County Eagle Archives is, well, it's profound.
A fire in 1914 destroyed nearly half a century of the county's newspapers. I mean, think about that. It didn't just eliminate data. It erased the intimate local history, the nuanced context, the daily struggles, and the names of thousands of people from this entire pioneer society.
So we're left with just scattered fragments.
We're left only with the scattered surviving excerpts, which is why we have to treat them with such weight. It makes that transition to the industrial era feel even more sudden because the full, detailed record of the pioneer past just poof, vanished in the flames.
That fragile, intimate agrarian world, defined by personal debt, violent feuds, and community resilience, was about to be shattered by the scale and, really, the cold calculation of massive industrial ambition. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because this is the story of Cap Gates and his vision and how it clashed head-on with the established social order.
The central conflict is personified by Edgar Woodrow Cap Gates. And he wasn't born into wealth. He started out cutting logs, but he had this, almost messianic ambition. He dreamed of establishing a massive, permanent sawmill complex.
But you can't understand his industrial drive without understanding his personal foundation, which was, well, it was trauma.
Absolutely. Gates lost his sight in a devastating Colorado mining explosion, and he used this catastrophe not as a setback, but as fuel for an almost pathologically resilient leadership style.
He had to prove himself.
He literally had to prove himself to the world and to himself, sight or no sight. He famously said that Crossett was born of my own restlessness and eagerness to prove myself. That single quote explains the scale and speed of everything that came next.
So Gates, along with his partners, the Crossett, Watsek, and his brother Charles W. Gates, they'd acquired this immense tract of land, 47,000 acres of prime virgin pine.
A huge amount. And their initial plan, back in 1901, was entirely logical. They slated Hamburg, the established county seat, the administrative hub, as the ideal center for their massive manufacturing operations.
But Hamburg delivered what has to be the most spectacular rejection in local industrial history.
Yeah.
They just refused to sell the necessary land.
They did.
And this wasn't just a simple property dispute, was it?
Oh no, this was a monumental sociological conflict. The Hamburg leaders were the agrarian elite, the planters, the established merchants. They feared Gates's industrial model because they believed it would, and I quote, corrupt their settled land-based social order.
And more practically, they feared economic disruption.
That was the real issue. Gates was offering unusually high industrial wages, for the time $1.75 a day. That would immediately hire away their crucial labor force, threatening the entire cotton and plantation economy structure. At the end of the day, they chose social stability and cheap labor over massive industrial investment.
So Cap Gates, being Cap Gates, didn't just pack up and leave. He took that rejection and used it to fuel an entirely new, self-contained project. He settled on a completely unknown piece of land.
Exactly. He pivoted to a location that was, for all intents and purposes, a deer stand beside a mammoth pine tree, aided by the advice of a Judge LaChalla. The land was perfect for industrial purposes, though.
How so?
It was higher than the surrounding area, and a little creek, Coffee Creek, could easily be dammed up to create an excellent mill pond. They incorporated and started building the complex by 1902, committing an incredible $1 million just for the initial setup.
And that first phase was just hellish. This is the birth of Tent City.
It was a raw testament to ambition over nature. The construction of the massive complex, 2 band mills, dry kilns, a planer mill, it all happened during the continual brutal rains of the winter of 1898-99.
So just mud everywhere.
Constant mud. The heavy machinery was impossible to move conventionally. It had to be sledded in using oxen, hauled through dense, sucking mud. Early life in Tent City was pure improvisation. Supplies were reliant on hunting.
Whatever you could get.
Deer, squirrel, turkey. There was no formal hunting season yet. Milk came from grazing cows.
It just gives you a sense of the sheer speed and improvisation of it all. I mean, Bill Williams, the very first baby of Crossett, was born in a tent in 1902. This wasn't planned. It was just happening right then and there.
And that speed and that control defined the town's very first act of organized social engineering, a legendary anecdote that's known as the saloon race.
I love this story.
Gates learned a saloon owner was planning to open up near the new settlement, and he knew that state law prohibited a saloon license within 1 mile of a dedicated church or school, so he acted instantly.
He used the entire industrial complex just to beat the clock.
Precisely. Gates employed all the mill hands, paid them overtime, and had them start, complete, and dedicate the first church and school building in a single frenetic day, using freshly cut mill lumber.
So the saloon builders had no idea.
They went to sleep that night confident they would open shop the next day, only to be blocked when Gates immediately sent an employee back to the county seat 13 miles away to inform the judge that the new church had been officially dedicated. That level of comprehensive, decisive control over the physical and social landscape that defined the Crossett bubble from its very first day.
The saloon race is the perfect transition, because once that complex was operational, Cap Gates wasn't just running a company. He was running a totalizing social and economic system. This is the Crossett bubble, where corporate paternalism governed every single facet of life.
The control was absolute, and it was intentional. The company owned virtually all the property, the land, the houses, the infrastructure, and crucially, no land was sold to residents for the first 46 years of the town's existence.
Which gave them total power.
It gave the company the power to dictate the social fabric, to ensure the town was well-run and orderly, and it specifically allowed them to bar radical labor leaders, riffraff, and other undesirables from getting a permanent foothold.
And even the aesthetics reinforced the system. All the company houses and the massive commissary, they were all painted Crossett gray. It was this visual uniformity that just declared, this town belongs to the company.
And the architecture was purposeful, too. The houses all used a specific hip roof configuration.
And for listeners who might not know the term, what does that mean?
It just means the roof slopes down on all 4 sides. This offers much better protection against the severe southern storms than a standard gable roof. Plus, the design naturally helped draw heat upward and out, which was a vital ventilation function in that hot climate. So form followed function, and both were dictated by the company.
And the economic heart of this whole system was the commissary, the legendary company Stowe. It was so much more than a grocery store. It was the financial anchor for the entire region, serving families for miles around.
It was a logistical marvel. The commissary handled everything. They shipped in a whole boxcar, loads of essential supplies, selling high-end goods like curly suits and rain shoes, right alongside feed and fertilizer. But the real mechanism of control was the currency.
Bronzes and scrip.
Exactly. Early wages were often paid in these local tokens.
Let's just pause on that for a second, because this is where the economics gets really technical and really critical. How did scrip function as a tool of control?
Well, unlike federal currency, scrip was non-transferable. It could only be spent at the commissary or other company-affiliated services. So while it was convenient for workers who needed immediate access to goods, it fundamentally trapped them economically.
So every dollar paid out in wages was engineered to come right back to the company.
Precisely. It maximized company profit and ensured workers remained economically dependent on Gates.
Yet, and this is the contradiction, this paternalism was also a vital safety net, especially during the Great Depression.
That is the staggering contradiction, you're right. The company extended extraordinary credit. They ran it year to year, and families were never sent a bill. If a family couldn't pay their debt at the end of the year, the manager would just roll the credit over, sometimes for several years.
So they prevented widespread hunger.
Absolutely. The company drastically cut prices. Flour sold for 35 cents for a 24-pound sack. Bacon was 7 cents a pound. The commissary was basically the local central bank, and it saved the community when the federal system was failing.
They even had these specific, quirky logistics systems that enforced the rigid efficiency, like the daily ice delivery.
Ice was a high-value commodity before refrigeration, you know. It was delivered daily via the ice cream wagon and controlled through an ice book. The iceman would check the book and deliver the precise recorded amount. Even in something as mundane as ice delivery, the system emphasized efficiency and order.
And the company dictated the literal rhythms of life. The sound of Crossett was the sawmill whistle.
That whistle, which was actually a ring of whistles designed to blow in unison, was the town clock. It regulated everything: work shifts, lunch breaks, even when church services were held.
And that control extended to utilities.
It did. The city power shut off nightly at 11:00 p.m., but you got a warning: a light blink at 10:05 p.m., 5 minutes before the dark. Interestingly, the whistle was also used compassionately. During searches for lost men in the woods, they'd blow long, sustained blasts so the lost person could orient themselves toward the sound of home.
And the high-end social center for management and visitors was the famous Rose Inn, named for Cap Gates' wife.
Built in 1913, it was a beautiful 3-story structure made of fine heart pine, painted green. Gates wanted the best. He hired a chef from Little Rock, outfitted the dining room with oak floors and huge ceiling fans. He was aiming for the highest cuisine between Little Rock and New Orleans.
But it served a double function, didn't it? It was also a co-ed dorm for teachers.
It was, which earned it the nickname the Co-ed Hotel.
The co-ed hotel.
Teachers paid a minimal $30 a month for room and board, which was a great deal, but they lived under institutional rules and had to share 1 bath and 1 commode per floor.
So you had this strange mix of luxury and communal living.
Exactly. And it often irritated the male guests who complained the female teachers were monopolizing the single bathroom. Sadly, the inn's fine heart pine construction meant that when it caught fire on a Sunday night in November 1913, it burned down completely and very quickly, leaving the town without lodging for a long time.
And the healthcare system was another crucial aspect of this paternalism. It was about ensuring the workforce remained functional and healthy.
It was. The Crossett Hospital was the only medical facility of any consequence across a huge swath of territory, essentially between Pine Bluff and Monroe, Louisiana. In the early days, they mostly handled...
You couldn't handle at home.
Right. But the subsidized costs were astounding. It was only $1.82 a month for an individual, or $5.70 for an entire family. A major surgical event like an abdominal operation cost only $100. This massive subsidy was the company recognizing that stable production required healthy workers.
Now, while the credit and the medical care sound great, especially during the Depression, we have to remember the core reality. Early wages were incredibly low, and this system could and did breed unrest.
It did. Early on, workers were earning a pittance 10 to 12 cents an hour, and the pressure eventually cracked that paternalistic facade in 1940 with a 2-month strike that paralyzed operations right after the paper mill was built.
So the workers pushed back.
They did. Primarily those in the new paper plant, but supported by the sawmill workers, struck for better working conditions and pay. And even during the Depression, though the company prevented hunger, they still had layoffs. They implemented a cold, calculated policy. The first to go were always those without dependents, ensuring minimal social impact on the community.
This industrial ambition, fueled by all this virgin timber, was inherently unsustainable. Cap Gates and his partners were following the common cut-out-and-get-out model. You take the resource, you move the mill.
That was the standard.
What's revolutionary here is that they consciously pivoted away from that destructive model and toward a world-class system of conservation.
The pivot was driven by a dawning and I think terrifying realization of depletion. Initially, company managers fully believed that once the massive virgin pine was cut, the lands were valueless for anything else. They poured money into trying to convert the cutover land into farms and ranches.
Yeah, it didn't work.
It didn't work. The thin pine land soil just wasn't suitable for intensive agriculture. These failures validated the hard truth. The land was only truly good for growing trees.
So the fundamental choice was binary. Move the entire operation or make lumbering permanent right where they were.
And they chose permanence. This marks the birth of modern scientific forestry in the South. Cap Gates declared, "The forest will live on." And this was influenced by successful, though smaller-scale, reforestation results they had seen elsewhere, notably the work of Henry Hartner as early as 1916.
So they saw that second-growth pine could be a viable product.
They realized it was already regenerating naturally in areas that were protected from fire, and it was reaching a marketable size. Scientific management, they concluded, was the only pathway to perpetual profit.
And this radical commitment led to the landmark partnership with Yale University and the establishment of the Crossett Experimental Forest.
The CEF, established in 1933, it brought federal government scientists right into the heart of their operation. But the motive for inviting the government was, well, it was highly pragmatic.
It was about fire, wasn't it?
It was all about fire. Crossett officials admitted they wanted the federal presence because they hoped it would deter the frequent incendiarism caused by 3 suspected woods burners who lived nearby and habitually set fires to clear land for grazing.
So these federal researchers arrived to find themselves working alongside the local Civilian Conservation Corps, the famous CCC boys from the Hamburg camp.
The CCC boys were the backbone of that initial field effort. They performed the critical first steps, carrying out a meticulous 100% inventory of every single tree on the experimental forest and constructing fire lines.
And their fire suppression methods were pretty hands-on.
Oh, brutal. Raking pine grass into swatters and using backfiring techniques, battling immense heat and thick smoke. This wasn't theoretical research. This was hard physical labor in the dirt.
But the real intellectual breakthrough, the concept that truly changed Southern forestry, came from a man named R.R. Reynolds. His innovation was selective cutting.
Reynolds proved with rigorous data that second-growth pine could be managed as a profitable, sustained crop. And in fact, it could be better than the transient wealth from virgin timber. His research methodology was the key.
What did he do?
Large-scale studies were initiated in 1937 using 24 40-acre plots. And these were designed to compare the profitability and yield of short, say, 3-year versus long, 5-year or more cutting cycles.
So what was the core financial insight that made selective cutting the superior business model?
It was all about volume and grade. In a short cycle, yeah, you might get more frequent cuts, but the volume of new growth was lower and the wood was often low grade. By extending the cycle, but just waiting an extra 2 to 3 years, the trees dramatically increased in diameter.
And that translated to better lumber.
Much better. That massive increase in diameter and height translated directly into a much higher volume of premium-grade board feet per cut, significantly increasing the financial yield. The profits from waiting outweighed the carrying costs. It proved that conservation was the best way to maximize profit over time.
And this scientific approach also required a fundamental shift in logging technology, right?
Yeah.
Replacing the methods of the pioneer era.
Right. Before the 1930s, skidding logs relied entirely on animals. Horses, mules, oxen, which often damaged the understory and struggled in soft areas. Reynolds' team introduced the first widespread use of caterpillar tractors for skidding logs.
A huge change.
The new crawler tractors were much faster and easier on the land, particularly in the wet, boggy areas common to the Bayou Bartholomew region. This mechanization improved efficiency and, critically, made selective logging feasible on a large scale.
And the ultimate goal of this entire scientific turn culminated in the idea of total utilization, that commitment to ensuring nothing was wasted but the whisper of the pines.
That ambition drove Crossett's industrial expansion way beyond just dimension lumber. In 1931, they built the chemical plant. This processed wood waste materials previously just thrown away to produce high-value chemicals like wood alcohol, glacial acetic acid, and something called tall oil, which they marketed under the brand name Secotal.
So it turned waste handling from a cost into a new revenue stream.
Exactly. And the paper mill continued this economic diversification.
Right, the paper mill in 37.
Established in 1937, it was built specifically to process inferior hardwoods and waste materials that the sawmill couldn't profitably use for lumber. This move stabilized the company's revenue streams and made the entire forestry operation more recession-proof. And they continued this goal later, expanding into flakeboard and particle board, manufactured entirely from mill waste, ensuring maximum value extraction from every single tree they cut.
Crossett's unique model of scientific perpetual forestry wasn't the only story unfolding in South Arkansas, though. Let's broaden our view to the surrounding regional hubs in Drew and Chico counties and see how they were developing at the same time, often in sharp contrast to the stable Crossett model.
We can start with Monticello, the educational center of Drew County. It's now home to the University of Arkansas at Monticello, which began as the agricultural school. But Monticello was, politically, a real flashpoint.
The Reconstruction-era tension there must have been enormous.
It was intense. In 1867, Monticello experienced severe political conflict. A military proclamation led to the removal of elected local officials, the sheriff, the clerk, who openly opposed the radical Republican Constitution that was imposed after the Civil War.
And they were replaced by locals.
They were replaced by local citizens who were branded scalawags or turncoats. This shows you a highly unstable political environment, which contrasts so sharply with the total corporate stability Gates was establishing just a few decades later.
Then you have Dermott, which was a critical center for the African-American community and education.
Dermott saw significant Black entrepreneurial activity right around the turn of the century. And most importantly, it hosted the Southeast Baptist Academy, which later evolved into the Morris Booker Memorial College in 1934.
And this was a vital institution.
Absolutely essential. It was led for decades by Principal York Williams, and it provided critical secondary education and religious training for African Americans at a time when public education for this population was just severely underfunded and restricted all across the segregated South.
And we also see that classic boom and bust cycle playing out in neighboring towns that didn't adopt the Crossett model.
Look at Wilmar. Wilmar boomed dramatically as a rail and mill town. It was even home to the former Beauvoir College, which closed around 1907. But its entire economy was based on virgin timber.
So when the timber was gone,
Once that accessible resource was cut out by the 1920s, Wilmar suffered a profound decline. This boom and bust fate is exactly what Cap Gates and R.R. Reynolds ensured Crossett would avoid.
and Selma.
Selma is known for hosting a unique Rosenwald school, which demonstrates the kind of community and philanthropic efforts that underpinned African-American education post-Reconstruction.
The Crossett bubble was so entrenched that when the company finally began to divest its control, it must have been a seismic social shock. This brings us to the end of corporate paternalism.
The slow transition began in 1946 with the adoption of the Bartholomew Plan. The most significant initial step was the sale of company housing directly to the employees.
Which gave them ownership stakes for the first time.
For the first time. And it reduced the company's absolute control over their lives. And in a final gesture of corporate stewardship, the company contributed $50,000 in matching funds to the local Baptist and Methodist churches to help them build new, modern facilities.
And on the delicate topic of civil rights, the company also took an enlightened, if controlling, stance on integration.
Yes, the transition to integration came cooperatively with the company's direct influence acting as a powerful lever. The company insisted on non-segregation in its facilities, and critically, it ensured that the facilities in the African-American T.W. Daniels School were often better and more modern than those available to Black students in other neighboring segregated towns.
When Crossett, the major economic driver, made a corporate decision, it generally stuck.
It stuck. But the era of family-owned singular control had to end. The Crossett Company was eventually acquired
By Georgia-Pacific in 1962.
That's right. The sale was partly driven by internal family owners who were dissatisfied and wanted to diversify their investments. It was a monumental shock to the community, a sudden end to a 60-year saga of family-driven paternalism.
And the ultimate physical symbol of that transition happened over a decade later.
In 1978, Georgia-Pacific made the definitive symbolic statement. They dynamited the famous 274-foot brick and concrete smokestack. That stack had been the visual marker of the Gates era for decades.
Landmark.
It was. It had been built to secure a natural draft for the boilers. It had long been obsolete, converted to electric power, but it cost thousands annually, up to $8,000 just to change the beacon light at the very top. Its dramatic destruction was the definitive physical end of the Gates era and the beginning of a modern, multinational corporate structure.
We absolutely cannot end this deep dive without acknowledging the folklore that persists right alongside all the heavy industry, the beautiful legend of the Crossett Light.
It really is the ghost story that truly embodies the town's mysterious, enduring spirit. The light appears on the old railroad tracks, visible from the Missouri Pacific line near Crossett, and it's a massive destination for young people seeking romance.
So what's the consensus on the cause? Is it science or is it romance?
It remains perfectly caught between both. Some say it's a scientific refraction of light from the highway, some complicated atmospheric phenomenon. But the local folklore, well, it prefers the magical legend of Rose Marie, who is forever waiting for her lost love, David, a railroad worker who supposedly dropped his lantern nearby many decades ago.
And the outcome of this light is far from passive.
Indeed. The light is alleged to have magical powers to bestow romance and even reconciliation. There are countless anecdotal reports of increased weddings and reconciling couples after visiting the spot. For many, it ensures that even in this highly structured, industrialized town, a touch of the romantic, untamed pioneer past, that wilderness essence flickers on. So our journey takes us from a heavily forested frontier where life was short and defined by disease and local feuds to this highly structured industrial society that accidentally, really, through the necessity of survival, became a global pioneer in conservation forestry. It's a remarkable, compressed transformation over just 60 years.
So what does this all mean for us? The core takeaway, I think, is explicit. The history of Crossett demonstrates how singular, restless ambition, Cap Gates's drive to prove himself, combined with rigorous scientific necessity, Arlo Reynolds's systematic approach, transformed a resource-rich landscape.
That's it.
It transitioned from a transient source of quick, destructive wealth into a managed, highly profitable, perpetual crop. And this provided a scalable, sustainable business model for the entire southern timber industry.
And the conservation was achieved not by some distant idealism, but by intense local economic pragmatism. They saved the forest because they proved that saving it maximized their profits long term.
That history is, ultimately, it's like the Crossett light flickering on those old railroad tracks. It's a story caught forever between the ghost of a rugged pioneer past, the violence, the hardship, the uncertainty, and the glowing, structured reality of a modern industrial society. It is the complex narrative of a town which ultimately survived the depletion crisis that its founders initiated. And my final thought for you, the listener, is this. When we look at large, successful, sustainable systems operating today, how often were they born, not from abstract foresight, but from a desperate, immediate corporate attempt to solve a crisis of depletion that the founders themselves were responsible for creating? How often does the threat of total failure truly breed the greatest innovation? Thank you for diving deep with us.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, the only place where we take, a century of sources, spreadsheets, and historical context and try to turn it into something fascinating that saves you hours of reading.
And today we are heading deep into the what seemed like endless pine forests of South Arkansas and North Louisiana.
Right. For what is, I think, a masterclass in long-term industrial survival.
It is. It's a phenomenal chronicle of industrial and really ecological evolution. Our focus is the Crossett Lumber Company, and we're tracking its history from 1899 all the way to 1999.
And we're really zeroing in on this massive pivot they made. How they moved away from the old ruinous model of just extracting virgin timber.
What our sources call timber mining.
Timber mining, right. And they moved to this radical, really forward-thinking system of sustained yield forestry, or timber farming.
And that core conflict is what makes this story so compelling, I think. Crossett was facing what was, for everyone else, the inevitable fate.
Yeah, for nearly every major timber operation in the South.
Okay.
Liquidation. Once the magnificent virgin resource was gone, the company shuts down, the mill closes.
And the community just becomes a ghost town.
Exactly. But they didn't. They created this highly technical, century-long plan to survive the resource exhaustion. And that's really the story we're unpacking today.
That intentionality is the central theme. The source material we've gathered. It chronicles this whole transformation. It blends scientific forestry reports, deep historical records about the company town.
And the critical financially revolutionary analysis that we're going to get into, known as the Wackerman case study.
Right.
So let's set up the great analogy we keep coming back to in the sources. This transition from running a gold mine to cultivating a high-yield garden.
It's a perfect analogy. The gold mine, it highlights the sheer immediate value of that virgin timber, but it's inherently temporary. Dig it all out, and it's gone.
Whereas the garden is all about long-term, managed, renewable wealth.
And to understand just how huge a change this was, you really have to establish the industrial baseline in 1899. When Crossett was founded, the standard business practice across the American South and West was summed up by that harsh phrase.
Cut out and get out.
Exactly.
And that model, it wasn't just a failure of imagination. It was actually a pragmatic financial response to the logistics of the era, wasn't it?
Precisely. Lumbermen would liquidate those spectacular virgin stands as fast as humanly possible to maximize that short-term return. And then, when the resource was exhausted,
It just pack up and leave.
they would move their entire operation, the mill machinery, the logging camps, sometimes even the actual rail lines, and just head west following whatever timber was left. They treated the land as a disposable asset.
Not an investment.
Not at all.
And what the founders of Crossett started with was, it was truly breathtaking. That immediate spectacular resource is what made the cutout philosophy so tempting.
Oh, it was magnificent. The founders initially acquired around 100,000 acres, and the sources showed that those virgin stands averaged 7,000 board feet per acre.
Which is a massive volume.
A massive volume. But there were specific tracts, the real prizes, the ones they targeted first, that were yielding up to 25,000 board feet per acre.
So for anyone listening who's not familiar with the measure, a board foot is basically a piece of lumber 1 foot by 1 inch thick. A standard new home today might use, 10,000 board feet?
Something like that.
So on those price tracks, they were getting enough timber to build 2 or 3 homes per acre just sitting there waiting to be cut.
Yeah, the scale was just astonishing, and they consumed it rapidly. Despite the size of the initial forest holding, the clock started ticking almost immediately. By the late 1920s, the financial managers, they were forced to confront reality.
The end of the big cut was in sight.
It was clearly in sight, and this triggered a true existential crisis. The company had to decide, do we plan our final cut and dissolve, or do we radically reinvent ourselves?
And it was real panic, right? Not just theoretical.
It was absolute panic. You can see it reflected in the company's internal financial records, especially regarding the forestry division, the very people who were supposed to be planning the future. In 1 year, they slashed the salaries of their forestry personnel, the scientists and land managers, by 50%.
Wow. That is a huge, devastating cut.
It is. And that tells you two things. First, management was desperate. And second, they viewed the forestry division, which was focused on long-term growth, as less essential than immediate production.
They were just trying to keep the lights on.
Exactly. Prioritizing the production side over the planning side. But what's even more telling is that the first cut didn't stop the bleeding. In a truly desperate measure a year later, management cut those same salaries, including the salary of our future visionary, A.E. Wacker-Hackerman, by another 50%.
So in just a couple of years, their entire pay was reduced to a quarter of what it was. That is a clear signal from management. We are running out of money, and we are running out of trees.
That level of financial stress just underscores the magnitude of the change they needed. If they couldn't find a new model, the entire enterprise, the town, the mill, the company, was going to collapse.
Okay, so that financial crisis of the late 20s and early 30s is the absolute hinge point of this story. But to really grasp the stakes, we have to understand what they were risking. Let's go back to the beginning. How did this monumental operation even get started?
Well, the initial capital commitment was substantial. The Crossett Lumber Company was established by 3 key founders, Cap Gates, E.S. Crossett, and J.W. Watzek.
And they launched the whole thing with $500,000 in capital.
Which was a vast sum at the time for those 100,000 acres of timber. And what's amazing is their chosen location. They settled miles distant from any existing infrastructure. No railroad, no highway, not even a navigable stream.
So the very first challenge wasn't even cutting timber, it was just getting to the timber. And more importantly, getting the timber out.
It was. Logistics dictated everything. Their logging operation in that extraction era was completely reliant on a massive investment in rail.
The sources detailed the expansion of their rail lines, right?
They do, chronologically. Before 1905, they logged mainly west and north. By 1914, the lines had shifted south toward Bastrop, Louisiana. And by the 1920s, the entire southeast area was just crisscrossed by logging spurs, with trains running daily.
The railroad was the lifeblood, but you mentioned earlier it was also this economic straitjacket that forced the cut-out and get-out model. Why couldn't they just use the railroads to haul lighter cuts?
The constraint was just the crushing expense of the infrastructure. Traditional rail logging required these heavy cuts to justify the enormous cost of laying down temporary dedicated logging spurs.
I see. So you had to clear the land, lay the track, bring in the engines.
Maintain the lines. Our sources say this kind of railroad logging was only profitable if you were cutting at least 2,500 board feet per acre.
So if you cut less than that, the investment in the rail line was more than the revenue from the logs. You'd be operating at a loss.
Exactly, which is why the system fundamentally required clear cutting or something close to it. You had to take everything to maximize the return on that fixed asset before you tore up the rails and moved on.
A one-and-done model.
Inherently non-sustainable.
But at the same time, parallel to this temporary extractive model, the founders were building something that just screams permanent commitment. The company town.
And that's the beautiful contradiction in the story. While the forest was being liquidated, the managers, who were described as just but stern men, were building this comprehensive paternalistic company town designed to keep workers loyal and stable.
It suggests they always intended the operation to last, even if the virgin timber didn't.
I think so.
So what were some of the practical elements of this paternalism? It sounds like they invested in amenities that were way beyond what was standard for a logging camp.
They absolutely did. They fostered an environment designed to bind the worker to the company through unparalleled services. For instance, the town had early access to electric lights by 1904.
From the mill's steam generator, right?
Yes, and a telephone exchange by 1907. This was decades before many nearby regional cities had comparable amenities.
That kind of infrastructure investment signals a commitment that goes way beyond a temporary camp. They wanted a workforce that stayed.
And their commitment to worker welfare was profound, especially in healthcare. They built a hospital in 1908. A U.S. government representative who visited actually praised it highly, saying it compared well with major city hospitals.
Wow.
And the employee health plan was comprehensive. It covered 30 days of room and board at the hospital for only $1.25 per day.
$1.25 a day. Think about that. Health security in the early 20th century. This must have drastically reduced labor turnover.
Which was a constant headache for transient logging operations. So the immediate financial benefit of the hospital and the cheap utilities, the cheap light and water, was a stable, healthy workforce that didn't constantly quit.
The investment paid for itself in reduced training costs and continuous production.
And the visual commitment to permanence was key. The company houses, they had these distinctive hip roofs, and the company made sure that the houses and their picket fences were kept freshly painted, all at no cost to the occupant.
That relentless maintenance signals stability. It makes Crossett look like a prosperous, established town, not a southern logging operation.
And the centerpiece of this whole social structure was the Rose Inn.
Named for the manager Cap Gates' wife, Rose.
Right. It was a 3-story, 45-room hotel that Gates intended to symbolize a town of gentle people. It was an effort to attract higher quality managers, teachers, professionals. They even hired a professional chef from Little Rock.
And it also served as a tool for sort of corporate oversight.
Oh, indeed. It was subtly integrated into the town's workforce management. The third floor often housed single mill workers and female teachers.
And the sources have some fascinating details here. The company maintained these strict social norms. They refused to hire married female teachers.
So the inn served as this temporary, highly supervised home for these essential female educators. The records mention a group in the 1930s sharing rooms and just one bathroom.
Which is a sign of that paternalistic control, blending business, social life, and morality, all in the service of maintaining a stable, non-transient labor force.
Absolutely.
So by the late 1920s, you've got this amazing permanent community, a massive fixed asset, but the natural resource that underpins all of it is vanishing, thanks to the very rail logistics that built the company in the first place.
The commitment to the community was about to clash violently with the reality of depletion. And that brings us directly to the moment of decision. The crisis was peaking, the forest was failing, leading to those brutal salary cuts.
They desperately needed a visionary solution.
And the man who provided that solution was A.E. Wackerman.
Let's really drill down into his background and the scale of the task he was given.
Wackerman was a trained professional forester, educated at Yale, which was hugely significant at the time. He came in 1927, right before the economic collapse, mentored by forestry giants like R.C. Bryant and H.H. Chapman.
So he brought this scientific rigor and modern sustainable forestry theory to a very traditional, old-school industrial environment.
And he endured the salary cuts, that 75% pay reduction in a terrible economy, yet he stayed. That level of personal sacrifice reflects a profound commitment to the idea that the forest could actually be saved.
And then that commitment culminated in the 1932 mandate.
The mandate resulted in the foundational document of Crossett's future, the
Mhm.
confidential case study, and the task was just profoundly radical, especially given the Great Depression.
What was it?
To analyze the financial feasibility of selective logging in a 20,000-acre tract known as the East Block. This was a direct, calculated rejection of the cut-out-and-get-out philosophy.
So when he used the word sustainability, what did he actually define that as? It couldn't just be some abstract ecological goal. It had to be quantified in dollars and board feet.
Absolutely. The core financial goal was defined as achieving perpetual yield. That means maintaining a stand of timber that produces enough growth to replace the amount removed in a very short time.
Okay, so he's looking for a forest whose biological interest, its annual growth rate, could cover the annual withdrawal of timber.
Without ever touching the principal, which was the standing timber volume.
So how did the actual mechanics of selective logging work on the ground to achieve that? This is where the scientific model really replaces that clear-cutting mentality.
It required a level of planning that was just foreign to the industry. Wackerman's plan detailed dividing the entire forest into 10 manageable units. The company would then cut only one unit selectively each year.
And what was the magic rotation time needed to ensure the forest didn't shrink?
The key was the 11-year cycle. By the 11th year, the first unit harvested would have, in theory, grown back to its original volume, making it ready for another selective reharvest.
So you're running a continuous machine powered entirely by natural regrowth.
That's the idea.
Let's get technical about the selection process, because this is where the conflict with the traditional lumbermen would have been sharpest. How did they decide what to cut and what to leave?
They used a sophisticated classification system. They planned to remove all the Class 3 logs. These were the undesirable ones, trees that were unprofitable due to heavy rot, poor form, or small size.
So removing them was crucial because they were suppressing the growth of the more valuable trees around them.
Right. You're not just removing the garbage, you're performing an essential maintenance function, giving the best trees more light, more water, more nutrients.
It's like ecological pruning.
Exactly. But here's the most counterintuitive part, the part that required absolute faith for management. They specifically left the healthiest, most valuable Class 1 and Class 2 logs in the ground.
Leaving the highest value product untouched for over a decade must have been an incredibly hard sell during the Great Depression.
When cash flow was critical, yes. Wackerman justified it through calculated compounding value. By leaving the best, healthiest trees, they allowed those trees to gain significant long-term value, often at accelerating rates.
So a quality log left standing for another 10 years grows more rapidly in volume and, more importantly, increases exponentially in quality.
Which commanded higher prices later. He was replacing immediate static profit with future compounded profit.
And this leads to the stunning financial perspective he introduced, the actual economics of growing timber.
This is the anchor point of the entire case study. Wackerman calculated the true direct cost of growing timber. He estimated it at $1.27 per thousand board feet over a 20-year period.
That number was revolutionary.
It was, because it shifted the company's entire internal accounting. Instead of treating the standing forest as an inventory item that was constantly being depleted,
The long-term plan was to reduce the overall timber investment to just a cost of growing level.
the forest stopped being a stockpile that got smaller every year. It became a perpetual appreciating financial asset. That $1.27 calculation gave the company the concrete scientific justification they needed to keep their land and invest in growth.
This was the moment they moved from mining to farming on the balance sheet.
That's it.
The Wackerman plan was mathematically brilliant. But he also concluded that this new model required a radical departure from the company's current methods. We need to explore the logistical revolution that made this plan physically possible.
Right. The plan required light cuts harvests frequently below that minimum profitability threshold of 2,500 board feet per acre.
And as we established, traditional railroad logging was economically impossible for these small, frequent, targeted cuts.
The infrastructure of the past was actively blocking the financial survival of the future. The tracks that built the company were now going to sink it.
So what was the solution?
The logistical leap, detailed in the confidential case study, was substituting those expensive, heavy, fixed railroad spurs with more efficient, flexible, rubber-tired truck hauling.
The truck was the technological answer.
It was the answer to the economic constraint of sustainability.
For a massive operation built entirely around, their whole corporate identity was tied to steam engines. How much internal resistance was there to this shift?
The resistance must have been fierce. It was a total overhaul of the operation, from how they cut timber in the woods to how they managed inventory at the mill. But the economics were undeniable.
Trucks were cheaper.
Cheaper to acquire, didn't require a vast, dedicated right-of-way, and, critically, could haul lighter loads quickly and efficiently over temporary unpaved roads.
So trucks didn't just move logs, they enabled the entire ecological strategy.
They did. The records show the incredible speed of the conversion. By 1939, truck operations had been perfected, allowing them to supply upwards of 100,000 board feet per day directly to the mill.
And that scale, combined with the flexibility, allowed them to actually implement Wackerman's 11-year rotation cycle with economic confidence.
They could enter a small forest unit, take only the Class 3 logs for maintenance, and leave without the massive cost of laying and dismantling rail lines.
And while the logistics were being revolutionized, the company sought irrefutable scientific validation for the ecological side.
Which leads us to the establishment of the Living Laboratory. In 1934, just 2 years after the case study was completed, Crossett donated 1,680 acres to the U.S. Forest Service.
And this land became the foundation of the Crossett Experimental Forest.
It did.
Why was this donation so critical for the company?
The mission was simple: provide scientific proof to support management's radical shift. They needed to demonstrate that degraded, cut-over stands, the very land that clear-cut companies abandoned, could be rehabilitated into productive, profitable forests.
So the experimental forest provided the crucial confidence, backed by federal scientists, that management needed to keep investing shareholder money into slow-growing assets during the Depression.
Exactly. And the scientist who executed that validation, turning theory into demonstrable fact, was Russell R. Reynolds.
R. Reynolds. He became the driving force, managing the experimental forest for 35 years.
His work translated the high-level science of Wackerman into practical, profitable methods for the common small landowner, which was key for the whole regional timber supply.
Tell us more about the Farm Forestry 40s. That sounds like the ultimate piece of outreach.
It was brilliant. Established in 1937, Reynolds set up demonstration plots, known as the Good 40s and the Poor 40s. He showed small landowners, side by side, how they could earn an annual income through sustainable harvests, rather than liquidating their entire asset one time.
And the results were compelling.
They were. He demonstrated growth rates averaging over 430 board feet per acre per year.
Let's put that 430 figure into context. Remember, the original virgin stands yielded 7,000 board feet, but only once.
Right. Reynolds was showing small farmers they could generate an unprecedented annual predictable income stream year after year just by managing their small plots sustainably. This convinced the entire community that the new way was not just ecologically sound, but highly profitable.
So we have the scientific foundation, we have the logistical capability with trucks, but one piece is still missing: industrial capacity. If you're selectively cutting smaller trees, you need to maximize the value of that smaller input.
This is where total wood utilization comes in, the zero-waste goal. It was essential for making selective logging financially viable. If you're taking a lighter cut, you cannot afford to waste any part of the log that reaches the mill.
They adopted the philosophy that nothing was wasted but the whisper of the pines.
And this required rapid and diversified industrial investment starting in the early 1930s.
The diversification was explicitly designed to consume waste, wasn't it?
Yes. The chemical plant was built in 1931, even before the Wackerman study was fully implemented, specifically to utilize hardwood waste and mill scraps material that would otherwise have been discarded or burned.
And it produced valuable industrial products like charcoal and acetic acid.
And wood alcohol. And then the paper mill, which came later, was a direct revenue-generating solution to the operational cost of managing the forest.
How so?
The paper mill, established in 1937, was intentionally designed to use the small-diameter trees removed during those essential thinning operations. These were the Class 3 trees that needed to be removed to improve the growth of the better trees.
So before the paper mill, removing that thinned wood was a pure cost.
It was just an expense. After the paper mill, it became valuable raw material for paper products. This genius move turned forest maintenance into a major integrated revenue stream,
making the Wackerman model instantly more attractive.
And this industrial synergy, where waste from one operation became the raw material for another, created this robust, diversified system that really cemented the long-term vision.
And this model was tested and perfected over the next few decades, particularly after the company changed ownership.
It was.
So let's transition into the legacy, which we track into the 1960s. In 1962, the Crossett Lumber Company was acquired by Georgia Pacific. Now, you might assume this would lead to a short-term extraction mentality.
But the opposite happened. The Georgia Pacific acquisition, while marking the end of the founding family's direct control, actually funded and initiated the final great industrial innovation that leveraged Crossett's sustainable assets.
The plywood revolution.
Exactly.
That sounds dramatic, especially since the South wasn't historically the place for structural plywood.
The innovation was technological. Traditionally, plywood was made using massive, old-growth logs like Douglas fir from the Pacific Northwest, only they had the size and consistent density needed. Post-acquisition, technology was pioneered to successfully make structural plywood from southern yellow pine.
And southern yellow pine was the dominant species that Crossett had been meticulously cultivating for decades under the Wackerman and Reynolds plans.
That's right. This technological breakthrough instantly leveraged Crossett's entire forest base. It shattered the Pacific Northwest's near monopoly on the plywood market. By 1964, just 2 years after the acquisition, the South had become a global manufacturing center for plywood.
Built entirely on the back of the sustained yield second-growth forests that Crossett had invested in since the 1930s.
The company that invested in growing future trees suddenly found a way to turn those trees into a vastly higher value product stream than they ever anticipated.
So let's just reinforce how this total utilization model, now including the high-value plywood maximized profit from those selective lighter cuts.
The integrated system became a closed-loop economy for timber. A single, selectively harvested tree could now feed multiple industrial plants. The high-quality heartwood went to the sawmill or the new plywood plant.
The small-diameter tops and low-grade logs went to the paper mill.
Hardwood scraps and mill waste went to the chemical plant. Sawdust and residual chips went to the particle board plant.
In other words, the profit margin on every acre was maximized not by the volume cut, but by the fact that almost 100% of the log was being utilized.
It was a perfect synergy. The financial survival of the company was secured, and this industrial security ultimately allowed the community to gain its independence.
Right. What happened to that deeply paternalistic company-town structure?
The post-war transition was a gradual but definite move towards self-governance. Once the industrial survival was secure, the need for the company to maintain absolute control diminished. After WWII, starting around 1946, the company began selling residential properties to employees.
And ceding control of municipal infrastructure, water, lights, roads.
Which meant Crossett transitioned from a company-owned structure to a thriving, self-governing community, emerging as an independent city by 1947.
The governance records show this shift. The town established improvement districts, passed its first property tax in 1952.
The industrial engine built on sustainability allowed the people to invest in their own community and govern themselves, rather than relying on the stern, just hands of the corporate founders.
And looking across that entire 100-year legacy, what is the ultimate, undeniable proof that the Wackerman and Reynolds model of scientific forestry succeeded?
The ultimate success is validated by the current reality of the forest itself. Crossett survived, avoiding the ghost town fate of its neighbors. The blend of scientific forestry and diversified manufacturing proved so effective that, today, the forest managed by the company grows more timber annually than the entire industrial complex can possibly use.
Sustainability became a self-sustaining system that generates a perpetual surplus. It's the rare case where long-term calculated investment generated abundance.
Completely debunking the short-term profit model that defined the rest of the industry.
Okay, let's review the key takeaways from this deep dive. You, the listener, have just been through a century of industrial change, and what should really stick with you is the sequence of these radical, interlocking pivots that saved the company.
We saw 5 distinct, coordinated shifts. First, just recognizing that the gold mine was finite. Second, the intellectual pivot led by Wackerman, calculating the cost of perpetual yield.
Third, the logistical revolution replacing fixed rail with flexible trucks, which made the whole ecological strategy feasible.
Fourth, the scientific validation from Reynolds in the experimental forest proving the model worked. And fifth, the industrial pivot, utilizing 100% of the log, turning maintenance into revenue.
The sources showed just how dire the crisis was. Salaries cut twice, massive debt, and intense pressure to just squeeze the last value out of the virgin fans and disappear.
They could have chosen immediate liquidation. That was the industry standard.
But they chose the opposite. They chose to face the high short-term cost, the investment in forest growth, in new machinery, in diversification, rather than accepting the catastrophic eventual cost of depletion.
And that ultimate cost of depletion wasn't just losing a resource, it was losing a community, losing decades of infrastructure, throwing hundreds of people out of work.
The cost Wackerman calculated for growing the future forest was $1.27 per thousand board feet.
That $1.27 investment was, in effect, the annual insurance premium the company paid to guarantee the existence of the town. They took that calculated cost of growth, which seemed so expensive in 1932.
And in return, they avoided the catastrophic cost of disappearance.
And that distinction between paying the calculated cost of growing versus waiting for the catastrophic cost of depletion is the most provocative thought to leave you with.
When you look at modern industries, whether it's in tech, energy, or agriculture, and they face an inflection point that demands a shift to sustainability, the cost often looks enormous and counterintuitive in the short term.
Yet the Crossett story shows that if that investment guarantees perpetual resource yield, it is the most rational long-term financial decision available. Who in your industry is choosing the high-yield garden, accepting that calculated $1.27 investment today, and who is still running the gold mine, delaying the inevitable collapse?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a century of survival in the Arkansas pine woods. We hope this masterclass in long-term planning gives you a fresh perspective on the cost of sustainability.